Okay, welcome back, everybody. I think that's enough. We can get started again. So, so this is the Paleo presentation. It's coming up now. Yes, got our one Paleo person down here. And I would like to. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Lucas. You're kind of in between. But actually, I'd first like to say that I'm kind of in between too. Like, I wouldn't actually call myself a paleo person, but I'm somebody who's interested in the ocean and ecosystems and climate and how these things are linked together, mostly because I want to understand what's happening now. And paleo just happens to be this tremendous archive of really useful observations that can help with the understanding of that. And so I think if there's one thing that you get out of my talk today, it's that paleo can be useful for everybody in this room. There's something that you can take from the paleo archives that are out there. And they're confusing and they're difficult to read, but hopefully you'll get that message from today. And I would like to especially thank Pages, which is a great organization based in Switzerland, Past Global Changes, that's been very active in trying to push linkages between modern observations and bring together really global syntheses of paleo data. And they contributed to funding a number of us to be here. So thanks to Pages for that. So why paleo? So basically, the observational record that we have is very short, really just a few decades of good high quality direct observations. And natural climate variability operates on scales longer than this, multi-decadal or even centennial time scales. And so we're always stuck with that timescale disconnect using observations. And the paleo record, exceeds that. It actually spans huge, tremendous long timescales. And it can give us a lot of natural analogs for the current problems that we're facing today. So ecosystem disruptions, ocean acidification, climate warming, all of these things have happened before. And so we can find out about those by looking in the paleo record. So today I'm going to quickly go through the history of the Earth in one calendar year, just to get you started after lunch. And then I'll talk a bit about what marine sediment records are made of, which is what most of the paleo world uses. And then I'll just talk briefly about some current developments and some examples. So first I'd like to talk about putting now in perspective. Now when we talk about the history of the Earth, there's always this problem because you're dealing with huge numbers. Millions of years, billions of years. Most of the time you can't remember what the difference is between millions and billions. They're just these huge numbers that don't mean anything. So I like to think of the history of the Earth as one calendar year. So if we imagine the Earth began at the beginning of January 1st, and right now it's New Year's Eve. We've got our noisemakers out, our hats on. So, right, so it doesn't matter if it's Chinese New Year or Western New Year. It's just, the idea is that we'll look at the history of the Earth compressed into one calendar year. So if we start off in January, it was basically very hot, nasty place to live, no ocean. The ocean appeared sometime in February when it got cool enough for liquid water to form at the surface. But then by March, there were cyanobacteria. So they were forming stromatolite mounds, like the ones you find in Shark Bay in northwestern Australia. And they kept going for a long time. It was pretty boring through most of the year, actually, until October, when the Earth got more interesting with multicellular life. So up until October, no multicellular life, very dull. But then it got more interesting mid-October, and especially mid-November. Around November 18th of the year was the invention of calcification. And suddenly things could make hard parts, and there was this fantastic explosion of diversity as organisms figured out what to do with calcite. November 26th was when things first moved on to land. Up until then, the land was pretty barren. So first land plants and animals, and they moved on to land, and we're having a nice time until the end Permian extinction wiped out most life on Earth. So this was the biggest of the mass extinction events. There were 5 mass extinctions identified in the Geological Record. And this one was humongous. So that was on December 10th. Happens to be my birthday. But it was the worst time on Earth, actually, the end Permian extinction. Which I think is good to keep in mind when we're getting depressed about how bad things are today. They were nowhere near as bad as they were on December 10th. It was a terrible time. And probably because of massive volcanic eruptions that poisoned the atmosphere, destroyed everything. But then after that, that paved the way for dinosaurs, which appeared then. It was also the beginning of dinoflagellates. They evolved just after this huge extinction, and so did coccolithophorids at the same time. And the dinosaurs did very well, right through December 20th, which was about when diatoms first appeared in the world. And dinosaurs and diatoms and everybody were enjoying life quite calmly for a long time until boom, another mass extinction. The day after Christmas, giant asteroid smashed the planet and again destroyed much of life on Earth. Not as bad as the other one. That was the most recent of the mass extinctions. I skipped the other three. But then this cleared the way for mammals. So mammals took over the world basically after December 26th. Some interesting things happened since then. This is one that it's particularly interesting for us in this room, I think. On December 27th, there was this remarkable warm spike in the geological record, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, when the CO2 levels apparently went up quite a lot, and there was a large ocean acidification event, which is very well recorded. December 29th, that's when Antarctica first became covered with ice as the global climate was cooling down. That's when diatoms really diversified and took over much of the world. So it was only December 29th, diatoms spread. Humans appeared, early hominids, so our hominid ancestors appeared on December 31st, kind of mid-afternoon, and that's also when ice ages began. And then our species, Homo sapiens, actually appeared at about 5 minutes before midnight. So well into the New Year's Eve festivities. And that was during the last ice age. That ice age only ended at 2 minutes before midnight, when humans just like us were all over the old world, hadn't quite gotten to the Americas yet. And then it was in the last minute before midnight that the climate stabilized in the Holocene, and that's when agriculture began. And soon thereafter, rice farming began. And then finally, the first satellite was launched at about 0.2 of a second before midnight. And that's really when the modern high-quality observational period begins. So just a couple tenths of a second before midnight is all that we can see from observations. So basically, the point here is that a lot of stuff has happened. There's a huge richness of Earth's history that we can delve into. We can learn about ecosystem resilience from looking at past extinction events, see how things responded before, and that can give us some good clues for how things will respond now to the human-caused pressures. We can learn about the response to CO2 similarly, past climate change. We can learn about what organisms do in the ecosystem by comparing what was like before they evolved with what was like after they evolved. And there's other things too, but the key to all of this is the geological record. So, what have we got for the ocean? So in the ocean, most of the work is really with marine sediments. So sediments that are on the modern seafloor today. And we can find these going back to the Mesozoic, so back to the time of the dinosaurs. There's also corals. People have been working a lot in getting very high quality records out of corals, both shallow corals and deep sea corals. That's developing very quickly, that's exciting. And there's also marine sedimentary rocks that are no longer in the ocean, but have been squished up onto land through plate tectonics, and now you get to hike around in the mountains to study those ones instead. And that's actually what you have to do for anything before the Mesozoic, because there's no seafloor left because of plate tectonics chewing it up all the time. You have to go on land if you want to learn anything before the dinosaurs. Yeah? Yes. So, absolutely. So here are ages of the seafloor today. So the colors here are showing how old the seafloor is in millions of years. So the oldest seafloor is in the Western Pacific, and that's up to something like 180 million years old. So I forget when that is. That's either Jurassic or Triassic. Early Jurassic or late Triassic. So dinosaur time. And then the youngest seafloor is, of course, at the mid-ocean ridges, where new seafloor is being produced. And then the seafloor moves out away from the ridges like conveyor belts, gradually accumulating sediments on top of it as it goes. Is that good? More numbers?
Yeah, no, I mean, just when you throw out something.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry, and thank you for. I mean, that's a good point. A lot of the geological stuff has all this annoying terminology that makes it very inaccessible. So I apologize on behalf of geoscientists for that. And it's something that should really we should get past because it doesn't help. So what are these marine sediments that give us these useful records from seafloors? Well, basically, it's just whatever junk is out there sinking and accumulating at the bottom of the ocean. So anything that's in the ocean that sinks ends up in marine sediments. So what is that? Well, the big components of what's out there are little bits of rock from land, so terrigenous materials, because they're coming from the continents. And so that includes dust, which can get out there because it's blown by the wind, or it gets washed out of rivers and gradually settles and is carried by ocean currents and settles down to the bottom. So that's one thing. Or also by glaciers. Glaciers actually carry very distinctive fragments out to sea. When the icebergs go out and when they melt, it drops on the seafloor. The next thing is bits of dead stuff, so things that are growing in the ocean, and then either the organic matter falls down to the bottom when they're dead, or maybe they produce shells, like diatoms and radiolaria have opal, or calcium carbonate on coccolithophorids or foraminifera. So all of these minerals can end up in the seafloor as well. And then there's also a little bit of minerals that actually grow in place in the seafloor, so they just precipitate directly out of the seawater. And then, so those are the main natural things that are in marine sediments. Actually, something that's starting to show up in marine sediments now is anthropogenic debris. People have actually started to measure the plastic concentrations in sediments as a tracer of, how much junk we're putting into the oceans altogether. So, interesting new thing there. Just to give you an idea of how thick that sediment is out there, this is a map of marine sediment thickness, and the scale here is going from 0 meters up to 20,000 meters. So you can see it varies quite a lot. Most of the world has less than 500 meter thick sediment. A lot of it, especially out in the gyres, where there's not much there. The water is very clean. There's very little dust, not much stuff growing there. So there, maybe in some places, you have as little as 30 meters sediment out in the middle of the gyres. Or at the ridge, of course, you start off with 0. And then you see there's huge thicknesses next to like where the Mississippi is coming out or where the Ganges is coming out. Yes. I don't measure this. I go to Google image search or here Yahoo image search. And, this is not measured everywhere in situ. There's some interpolation here, but either from direct measurements or from seismic. So you can send seismic waves through the sediments and see quite well how thick the layers are. And actually, people use seismic a lot when they're going to look for places to sample the seafloor so that you can find places with nice sediment accumulation where it looks like it's regular, because it's not regular everywhere. There's basically the equivalent of strong storms and currents on the seafloor that make things like snowdrifts. For those of you from cold places, or basically that move the sediments around. So you want to avoid places that look messy and use seismics to find nice, gradually accumulating mud. That's what we want. And to go get that, there are a few ships in the world that can go out and sample the seafloor for scientific purposes. This is a very special one. This is the JOIDES Resolution, which is operated by the International Ocean Drilling Program, which is a large international consortium. It's a very expensive program, but it was originally the deep sea drilling program, and then it became the ocean drilling program, and it's still going strong. They have a couple other platforms now too, but this is the most important one really. And it's the only existing ship that can drill with a rotary drill with diamond tip bits at the bottom into the deep crust. And so it's unique in the world for that. But actually, for the shorter timescale things, for the last few minutes of the Earth history year, which a lot of us are most interested in, there are a number of other ships that can go out and take piston cores. So you don't have to drill, you just take basically a big tube of metal and put a bunch of weight at the top of it, a few tons of weight at the top, and then stick it down into the sediments. It's like taking a straw and putting it into a milkshake, and then you cover your finger at the top and you pull the milkshake out. And so it's basically the same thing with the seafloor sediments. And then, so that's a piston core, and then you bring it back up onto your ship, and you got this big tube full of delicious mud, and then you pull out the plastic liner and chop it up, split it open, cut it very delicately with a piano wire, and then you open it up, and it's like a book, going back in time to tell you what's accumulated at that spot on the seafloor. And you lay it out in the lab, and you look at it, and describe it, and eventually send it back to graduate students in labs to analyze it. And what do you analyze it for? Well, so basically for indicators, which we call proxies. So usually, you're always interested in things that are not in the sediments. You don't look at the sediments as a paleo climate or paleo ecologist person to learn about the sediments yourself. That's what sedimentologists do. They're usually kind of boring. But really, you're interested in something that happened in the ocean, which is reflected in the sediments. So we're always relying on these secondary proxy data to tell us, what was actually going on in the ocean in the past. So for an example, seawater temperature is obviously something that we're very interested in from, a paleoclimate perspective. So there's been a lot of work, huge amount of work, for many decades on proxies for seawater temperature. So the longest one of these, really the original paleoclimate proxy, was the oxygen isotope ratio of calcite. This was actually theoretically predicted by Urey in the 40s based on calculations to reflect temperature, and he was right. That's why they don't give him a Nobel Prize for nothing. But this really launched the field of paleoclimate study, and usually foraminiferal shells are used for this, so I'll come back to you. People discovered later you can also use elemental ratios in shells, like magnesium calcium, to give an independent measure of this. More recently, they're using clumped isotopes. So this is harder to measure and more complicated, so it sounds better. Everybody's excited about this now. There's an organic proxy that's actually, I think, excellent. This has been developed over the last decade to a huge degree, and it seems to be working very well, called alkanones, the alkanone unsaturation index. That one seems to work very well. And there's another newer one, the new kid on the block is TEX86. So alkanones are an organic component made by premnesiophytes, and TEX86 is made by archaea. And we don't really know what either of those molecules are for, but for some reason they seem to represent the temperatures of the seawater. So if it works, great. Another thing we're interested in finding out about is productivity. How did productivity in the ocean vary in the past? So some proxies for that are the concentration of organic junk that ends up in the sediments. So there's different things I mentioned before. People also use molecular biomarkers to try and figure out different organisms. There are some that represent diatoms, in particular, for example. Dinoflagellate cysts turn out to be well preserved in sediments, and if you're one of the experts in the world that can actually identify what those little smudges of blurry dinoflagellate cysts are at the species level, then it can tell you a lot about past changes in productivity. Foraminiferal assemblages, this is the different species reflect different growing conditions. And also, since many people here are interested in fish, there's been some work into trying to use fish debris, so scales and bones, to try and reconstruct past changes in fish. And most places this doesn't work. You have to have anoxic sediments, but there are actually lots of anoxic sediments in coastal regions, and I suspect that this is something that really has not been exploited to the degree that it could be. I think there are probably lots of potential good fish records out there that haven't been used. Yeah.
Using these boxes, you will be able to quantify the productivity?
So quantifying is a big word for most paleo proxies. Actually, the dinoflagellate cysts do have there's a good, multivariate, they use a couple different techniques, neural networks and modern analog techniques in order to actually try and quantify primary productivity from the dinoflagellate cyst assemblages. And it looks pretty good, actually. That one's kind of plus or minus 20%, which is good given the large range in primary productivity. The other one's not so much quantitative, but there's always potential to improve them. Yeah. Any other questions about anything so far? Okay. Yes.
Fish debris, how do you quantify from that fish debris?
It's mostly counting. just with a microscope? Just counting, so fish scales. So like you take the sediment and you cut it up in pieces and you wash it. Just counting how many fish scales there are. So people have done this for anchovies quite a bit. Actually, so Lucas Kavanagh has been looking into records of this and trying to put together global records. So if you want to find out more, yeah, go to Lucas's post. And I mean, right, as Lucas can tell you, again, the quantitative link between the number of scales and the number of fish that were in the water column is a bit sketchy. But, you know, I mean, why not? I mean, fish are shedding scales all the time, and I'm sure there's some relationship. But it's early days for that.
Modelers look for numbers. So
Yes.
for example, we have equations using these temperature equations for different oceans. So there is, when we do isotopes, we can at least convert it into some numbers. So that's the main question that modelers come up with. How do you quantify it?
Absolutely, that's right. That's right. And for things like temperature,
Yes.
it's quite good. Yeah, that's right. Okay, I just keep going here. I was going to, right, so this is, so a lot of the work is done by grad students like this, sitting at microscopes for hours picking things out of the sediments. So, but as these things have been developing, it's really put together a very strong understanding of how climate has varied especially over the Cenozoic. I mean, so this is the period when there are marine sediments from all over the world. So this is the last 65 million years since the dinosaurs went extinct with that big asteroid impact. And I think this is probably, this is from a couple of years ago, but I think this is probably a pretty correct estimate of what the deep ocean temperature has looked like since the dinosaurs went extinct on the left-hand side. So, you know, this is the last few days of the calendar year, and as you can see, it was pretty warm in the Paleocene and Eocene. Sorry, I used those words again, but in the early part here between 65 and about 35 million years ago, and then things cooled down quite a bit, starting at about 35 million years ago with the dramatic growth of the Antarctic ice sheet. People have been also working pretty hard on proxies for CO2 concentrations for the atmosphere. And that was very difficult at first, but they seem to be getting much better now. There's been a big improvement in these proxies over the last few years. And it seems that there's this pretty consistent picture of high CO2 between, you know, about 55 and 30 million years ago, and then much lower CO2 since the growth of the Antarctic ice sheet, about 35 million years ago. And just for comparison, I hope you can see the numbers, but they're going up to 2,000 ppm there. So a place that we won't be up there for at least 100 years. The place where we are now is 400 ppm, which is shown by the dashed line across the bottom. So we're higher than it's been for most of the last 30 million years, but there are these high CO2 analog worlds further in the past that can be very interesting to study. And this is from a very useful review paper on geological archives for ocean acidification. If you haven't seen it, Heinisch et al. In Science 2012. But they point out a number of different periods over the last 300 million years where CO2 concentrations became high, and there should have been rapid ocean acidification. So you can see, for example, there's a peak at the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. This one right here, when CO2 jumped up very high, up to something like 2,000 from maybe 1,000 before that, and very high back here, very high back at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary. So great acidification analogs. So since we're not measuring these things directly, there's always problems. I mean, we have proxy uncertainty with all of them. As Donald Rumsfeld might say, there are the known knowns and the unknown unknowns. But meaning for these proxies, there's the things that we know are uncertain with the proxies, but then there are also things that we just don't even know about that are probably problems. So we always have to take all these things with a grain of salt. Yeah.
It's lucky he said that, because I've seen him cited only for this, not for other
No, that's right. That was his main contribution to humanity, I think, was that. I don't know if it made up for the other things that he did. But, but some of these proxies are more mature than others. Actually, I didn't put it there. There's a great relationship between proxy certainty over time, which is known as the Elderfield curve, which is that when a proxy is first developed, there's high confidence in that proxy. Then immediately after that, the confidence falls to 0 or sometimes even negative in the proxy, but eventually it comes back to some intermediate value. So always beware new proxies. Old proxies are often the most reliable. The other big problem with paleo records is that you have to worry about the time axis. So if you're used to thinking about modern observations, you don't think about uncertainty in the time axis. But with the paleo world, that's a huge source of uncertainty because the time axis is vertical through the sediments because they're accumulating over time. So actually these are sediments from the Gulf of California, and you can see they have these nice bands, which are actually annual layers. But you can see just looking at those annual layers there that they're not always the same thickness. So even from one year to the next, the sedimentation rate can vary. It can also vary on decadal or centennial or millennial timescales. Sedimentation rates are always varying, which gives you stretch in your time axis. And globally, the sedimentation rate can vary a lot. So in coastal waters, it can be like a millimeter per year. But in the deep ocean, maybe it's 1,000th of that sedimentation rate. So you also have to think about the sedimentation rate when you want to try and resolve different timescales. And a good site is going to be a place that has relatively consistent sedimentation rates. So you don't have too much stretching in that time axis. And there are many good sites. So if you want to put some ages on your time axis, there's really 2 ways you can do it. One of them is relative age dating, where you correlate your stratigraphy between different sites. So basically, you measure something that should be synchronous across distance, and then you look for wiggles and you tie them together. So say you have, oops, sorry, you can't really see that. But imagine you have, hopefully you can see there's a couple measurements there. So these wiggly lines in 2 different sediment cores from different places. And you can see some features there, and maybe you could say, okay, I'm going to tie these ones together and assume that these wiggles are synchronous because they happened at the same time, because you're measuring something that should have been synchronous across distance. And that could be fluctuations of magnetic particles that are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, or it could be the chemical composition of the seawater, or it could be volcanic ash layers, or it could be rapid warming or cooling events that you can see recorded. So these give you relative sensitive, ways to link cores together. The other thing is putting absolute numbers on it. And really the only way to do that is using radioisotopes. And there's different radioisotope things that you can use further back in time, but for the time scales that are probably more interesting to us, like the time scales of centuries or thousands of years for most of the time, there's lead-210, which is produced from uranium decay in the water column and gets scavenged and accumulates in the sediment, so you can use that for the last century. And then there's radiocarbon, so C14, produced in the atmosphere, decays with a 5,000-year half-life, and so you can measure it in sediments and use that for up to about 40,000 years until the concentrations are so small that it's undetectable. And to give you an idea of how you might use that, here's just an example from the literature. So this is a sediment core from coastal Namibia, which is showing the depth in the core in centimeters. So this is a piston core, about 9 meters long, and they've measured C14 in forams, so in calcite shells in the sediment core at these points shown by the diamonds. And then they have a calibrated age where they take into account changes in the atmospheric delta C14 from changes in cosmic ray production of C14, and also for the disequilibrium between the atmosphere and the surface ocean. And then you get a calibrated age. And you can see that they make a pretty smooth curve of the age. So basically you know the age with some error bars at those points. Clearly there have been changes in the sedimentation rate that probably have to do with winnowing at this site. So you can see there's a change in the grain size fraction in that solid line. So when you get coarse grains, that means there's been stronger bottom currents that have moved away more of the material, so the sediment accumulated more slowly. anyway, it kind of fits with the changes in the curve. But then once you've got that, you've got your age model. So like any model, it's incorrect. It's not exactly the ages that you've assigned with your age model there at any point, but it's close enough. And these age models are the worst thing in paleo, actually, because it's this terrible error that you always have to deal with, and everybody's always embarrassed of their age model because it's the most important thing in your record, and it's never good enough. And so unfortunately, they tend to hide the details. So I'm involved in some things right now trying to really push people to be more honest and record their age model errors, because this is hugely important for using large data sets, is knowing how much of an uncertainty there is. So that's the basic idea. Any questions about that? About developing these sediment records? Okay. So just a couple things about new developments. Well, analytical techniques are always improving. Thankfully, it helps things moving forward. And people are always thinking of new things to measure. I mean, as I said, there's all kinds of junk in marine sediments. And really, I mean, I think we've only scratched the surface of what there is in there that you could measure. So it's really just thinking of what you want to find out about. You know, I think there's probably a lot of ecosystem information in sediments that we haven't even really tried to measure for yet. So I think there's probably a lot there we could look at. A lot of the work has been going into higher and higher resolution in recent years, so going to annual resolution or sub-annual resolution in records, and also bridging to the observational record. I think that's an exciting thing that people are doing more and more. So getting sediment records that actually overlap with this observational period of the last 50 years, so we can calibrate things properly and really get a longer timescale view, and also looking at things globally. So a lot of paleo stuff, also coming from this geological kind of culture, has been this kind of cowboy science, where like somebody goes and gets their sediment core, and then they work on that, and they publish their papers about it, and then they don't share the data, and it's just this like little island of research that's lost. And now there's some big efforts to try and put together global compilations to get all the data together, so we can compare it with models and actually do more quantitative science with this stuff. So this is just an example of one of these efforts. I've had a postdoc, Olivier Cartepenis, who's been working on trying to get all of the data from the public repositories and put it into usable MATLAB files so that you can look at everything globally. And it's been a lot of work. There's a lot of formatting issues. But this is just an example for the data that he has now in his database available for the Holocene, so you know, the period of human agriculture, basically since the end of the last ice age, so the last 10,000 years. And so each one of these sites has at least 20 measurements with an age over that time period at these different water depths. So you can see there's a lot of data. It's globally distributed, and probably many of the ecosystems that you might be interested in around the world are well represented here. And this isn't all of the data. This is just what we've managed to get in here so far. So there is a lot of data out there. Yeah.
So it looks like this clusters of data,
Yes.
North Sea, Baltic, Mediterranean, etc. I'm just wondering, within those sort of more localized regions, what kind of work's been done there? What kind of work's been done there? Are they individual studies, or are they studies that have been brought together within those regions? And what can you learn from that to sort of dig out the global?
I mean, so I think a lot of the distribution has to do with where the scientists are, and also where the scientists are who archive their data publicly. So I think you can see that actually Pangaea is based in Bremen, which I think is at the center here of highest data concentration. As you move away from Bremen, you you get less data storage. I don't know. So I think it has a lot to do with that. But most of these points are individual studies. So for most of these dots here, there was one paper about that one dot, or maybe a paper about a couple neighboring dots in one system. But there's been very little large-scale work in paleo, very little global or even regional. Yeah, it really tends to be one record at a time.
Is that because people spend so much time and effort getting that one data set?
Yeah, so that's part of it. It's a lot of work. It's pretty labor intensive most of the time. And also people are measuring different things. There's hundreds of proxies that people measure in cores. So and they're rarely, I mean, usually it's just a few that are measured on any one core. So it's really just been like these local people working on their own without much coordination. So we're trying to push that.
The Ganges, I mean, that, going back to your other point, just where the
Yeah.
real action is.
Right.
It seems a bit of an oversight.
Yeah, I agree. There's some very important holes on these maps.
I would really say that yes, there's a lot of data in the Arabian Sea and the Ganges area, the Bay of Bengal, but it's about public archiving, I suppose. It's about archiving the data on public portals which people can. But I think there is a lot of work, especially in the Arabian Sea, which is having geochronological control, and it has been published. But yes, publishing is one, and giving raw data sets is another one.
That's right,
So
absolutely.
that's what I understand is not here. The raw data set is not shared.
Exactly.
But otherwise, yes, there are a lot of papers in this area which give geochronology also. But I think it's the raw data set which is not publicly available.
Yeah, I think, I mean, just from, for nitrogen isotopes, we went through very carefully and tried to get all the data. And so we found that about a quarter of it was available publicly. And 3/4 of it, we had to go to the investigator and ask them to email us the data. Well, I'll just talk, well, maybe very briefly about this, because I've worked a lot personally on the last glacial maximum and the end of the last ice age, so I have to mention it. But that's also a period where people have really started to look globally for the past few years, especially through PAGES working groups. So this was the Margot working group of PAGES, where they pulled together all the different sea surface temperature proxies for the last glacial maximum and produced this map, just so you could see the amount of cooling that seemed to have occurred at the peak of the last ice age relative to today. And you can see that their temperature is up to something like -8 relative to today, which is based on all the locations shown on the map on the right. So this is good. So this is actually to the point now where these paleo records can be used with error bars. These had full error estimates for all the temperature proxies to give an idea of climate sensitivity, which remains one of the big questions in climate science. So they could actually constrain the IPCC temperature range to a smaller set of values based on just how much the planet cooled with very well-known PCO2 at the last glacial maximum. And after the peak of the last ice age, there was this 10,000-year period called the deglaciation, when the huge ice sheet sitting on Canada melted. And that's actually a very interesting period to look at, I think, because we know quite well now from these global temperature proxy reconstructions that the global temperature increased by something like 3 degrees Celsius. And this is very similar to the climate warming that we expect over the next century kind of time scale. So it's a very good analog for modern warming, except that it happened over 10,000 years instead of 200. But I think there's a lot we can learn from that. And just as an example of that, I've been working quite a bit with a colleague, Sam Jacquard, on looking at changes in oxygen concentrations in seawater. So because we're worried about deoxygenation in the future, we wanted to see, if you calculate how oxygen should have changed from the last glacial maximum to the present based on solubility, just because as the water warms, the solubility goes down, you would expect a change in oxygen concentration this is plotted in sections through the Atlantic, Indian, and Pacific Ocean, as indicated by the background shading there. So you'd expect that everywhere the oxygen concentrations would go down. But when we actually looked at a global compilation of proxy data for how the oxygen actually changed, we could see, and it's not quantitative, so it's just, did it go up or down based on the colors, orange or blue? We found that actually in most of the ocean volume, the oxygen concentrations went up at the end of the last ice age, rather than going down. But it was really in the Pacific Ocean, in that big hypoxic zone that's in the intermediate depth Pacific Ocean, that's where the oxygen really went down when the ocean warmed up last time by 3 degrees. So why did it go up everywhere else? Well, it's got to be to do with ecosystem processes. It's not just a simple change of the temperature of the ocean that did it. And similarly, we've been looking at changes in denitrification. So how did the nitrogen cycle respond globally at the end of the last ice age? And here we see that going with expectations here, because the oxygen concentration fell in the upper ocean, there's actually an increase in denitrification rates in oxygen minimum zones. And sorry, it's kind of blurry. You can't really see that. So just take my word for that one. And then, I was just going to show you this is another Pages working group on, they've been putting together a very comprehensive global temperature data set from different continents. So, I mean, we've had years now, we've had to look at we've just had the one wiggly line of the hockey stick plot of, temperatures being flat and then jumping up sharply at the end. But now there's this development of a more nuanced global picture where you can see how the different continents have changed individually. And so you can see this is going from year 1 to year 2000. And you can see it was actually quite warm for most of the first 1,000 years of the past 2 millennium. And then things were in this general cooling trend until the 20th century, when all of a sudden the temperatures jumped back up again. Like, this is useful for getting the global context of where we are today. And finally, this last thing, this last example, I thought this was a nice example of some very high resolution marine sediment work linking to observations in Africa. So here's a sediment core from the coast of West Africa, and compared to a lake record. And what you can see here is that people have argued about increases in dust in West Africa being a result of the Sahel drought, natural climate changes. And what they were able to show with this record was that when you look over a 3,000-year span here, there's an increase in dust flux recorded in the sediments. It's very, very sharp at the end. And if you look at this climate record from this lake, which is telling you something about precipitation patterns, you can see there's variability, but not really anything dramatic at the end. So, and actually when you zoom in closely, you can see that the dust concentration in the cores, shown there in red in the middle panel, matches very well with the observed record from Barbados there in black. And so what they were able to argue with this was that it's actually agriculture. So it was the beginning of industrial agriculture in this region that disturbed the ground and actually caused this large increase in dust flux. So I think there's a huge potential to do similar things like this with all kinds of marine ecosystem things, linking these high resolution records together with observations in order to see anthropogenic impacts within this much longer time span context of what was going on for the past few thousand years before. So to summarize, I think the Earth has a lot of history. There's a lot of stuff that's happened, and it's archived in all kinds of ways, many of which we haven't even imagined yet, in geological records that are largely untapped. And for the rest of our lifetimes, the Paleo record is going to be the only data that we have available which it really spans climatic timescales, because they're long, multiple centuries. The good news is that there have been rapid improvements in the observational techniques for Paleo records, and there's some big efforts just getting underway now to construct global databases that will hopefully be usable by a much broader community. So hopefully you can all perhaps look at Paleo records as part of contextualizing your own research at some point in the future. And yeah, that's it. Thanks very much. Anybody want to ask any other questions or say anything else? Okay, great. Excellent question. So, well, I was going to mention that later because, but we are hoping that as part of your group work, you could think about bringing in some Paleo observations as you hear about later, but there are basically two big databases in the world that archive all of this information. One of them is there's a NOAA-based one in the US, and there's also a Pangaea, which is the bigger one based in Germany. And so they're not the easiest things to navigate. Pangaea is better to navigate, actually, I think. And it's a problem of there being too much information. There's a huge amount of information there available. But if you're looking in a particular region, they're actually very good. You can zoom right in on a region that you're interested in and see exactly what's available. And there is information for most parts of the world.
So if you want to use them in the future, this is your opportunity to ask the experts in terms of the databases. Not right now, but during the week.
Yes, and please do.
There was a question. Brad, did you have a question?
Just a small technical question. When you were talking about the stretching the lines, how you can be sure what should be the scale when you stretching the lines on the slice you showed us?
Yes, you can never be sure.
So how can we trust your data?
What, you don't trust me?
No,
No, I know.
I just wanna understand
It's a huge
how-
problem. It's a huge problem. So, I mean, one thing that I am hoping will happen, but I just don't want to have to do it. There's a few other people who are thinking this way too, but we really, I think, need objective algorithms to generate age models from chronological constraints so that you can enter the C14 ages in a database. I think we need to have large databases that just have the raw chronological constraints, and then some kind of algorithm that can take into account, changes in the sediment characteristics and uncertainty windows in the measurements themselves, and then give you an age model with a moving window of chronological uncertainty through it. I think that's really the only way to move forward. But it's a pain, so nobody's done that yet. But if you would like to contribute with your mathematical background.
why not? I mean, for example, if you assume some special oceanographic conditions that were in the past,
Yes.
You need to know something about paleoceanography to assume the sediment accumulation speed, accumulation rate. You need to build some kind of paleoceanographic models or sort of.
I mean, the thing is the scales of sedimentation variability can be quite small. So I mean, they can vary. I mean, people do these depressing tests where they look at sediment accumulation here and like on the other side of the room, like 10 meters away, and they find that they're quite different. So, I mean, you can basically have like ripples on the seafloor that change things quite locally. So, knowing the big picture actually might not help all that much. It's really a study of the individual sediment core itself. But this is why it comes down to, I mean, a lot of it comes down to picking good records. So, there are sites that are good, where the seafloor is nice and flat and is homogeneous and the sediments accumulate very regularly. So really, it's better just to focus on the good sites.
And could multi-proxy approach increase the reliability of our interpretations?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, multi-proxy,
Several proxies
that's right.
in the same core.
That's right. I should have put that in there actually. I think the most important way to deal with proxy uncertainty of a single proxy is to use more than one. If you get the same thing in three different proxies with their own biases, then you can maybe trust it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.